He'll be okay. Good evening, everyone. We're continuing in the story of Joseph. Darrell left off where Joseph was in the house of Potiphar. He was doing really well. God was with him, and he was a man of good character. Yeah, it's sort of in there. Thank you. I can actually see my paper now. It's better. So we see that Potiphar's wife starts tempting him. Joseph resists. He says it's wrong. Finally, she corners him, and he just flees. She's insulted or afraid that maybe she'll be found out, and so she accuses Joseph of having tried to have sport with her. And so what we find out is Potiphar comes back, she accuses him, and I don't know if Potiphar was really convinced of his wife. I have a feeling that he had a lot of trust in Joseph, but we don't really know the story completely. But he doesn't have him killed, he has him thrown in prison or in jail. And that's kind of where we left off here. So we're in the end of Genesis 39, verse 20, and we're going to just read a few passages here and there as we go through the story. In Genesis 39, starting in verse 19. It came about when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spoke to him, saying, "This is what your slave did to me," that his anger burned. So Joseph's master took him and put him into the jail, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in jail. But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. And the chief jailer committed to Joseph's charge all the prisoners who were in the jail, so that whatever was done there, he was responsible for it. And the chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper. So again, even in jail, Joseph is finding a little bit of freedom and relief in that he was given some responsibility by the chief jailer. So first question I want to ask is, how many years approximately, what's the maximum really, that Joseph could have been in this jail? Does anyone know? How old was he when he basically got sold by his brothers, or at least close to the age? It tells us in chapter 37, verse 1 or 2. How old was he when he got sold? 17 years old. And how old was he when he became ruler? When he basically was taken out of the jail?
30.
About 30. So now we've got about 13 years, and it had to take a little time in the household of Potiphar to rise to that position. So probably somewhere at least 10 years, but it could have been a lot longer in Potiphar's house. We just really don't know how long he was in the jail. But he was there for a while. What we do know, that he was there for at least how many years? We're going to find out in chapter 41. 2 years, at least 2 years, and probably a lot more than that. And we were talking about this last week, that you can imagine somebody like Joseph, after what happened to him with his brothers, they wanted to kill him. I think they threw him in a dry pit. I think part of the idea of the dry, possibly, is the fact that there was no way for him to survive there. So instead of just physically killing him, they could just throw him in the pit and leave him, and he would die. I don't know, but that's what Josephus thought about it. That's reasonable. But then he's brought to Egypt. He's a slave. He's doing okay, and he's working hard, and he's doing the right things, and he makes good decisions, and he even makes the right decision with Potiphar's wife, and he gets thrown in jail for it. You can imagine, I don't care who you are, you're going to be discouraged and frustrated, maybe a little angry at the moment for it, but he didn't stay that way, obviously. And that's the point. He reflected on trusting in God. His faith carried him through, and it prepared him for what was coming later. So we find out in chapter 40 now that these two officials, a cupbearer and a baker, are thrown into the prison. And both of them were on the bad side of the Pharaoh, obviously. And then one day they both have a dream. And Joseph sees them in the morning, and they're despondent. And Joseph says, "What's going on, guys?" And he says, "Well, we had dreams, and there's no one to interpret them." And so he said, "Well, they belong to God. Tell them to me." And I believe these dreams were not just for those men. What would be important about these dreams? What would really be important about these dreams? Hint, who else had dreams? Didn't Joseph have dreams earlier? And they were dreams that were about the future and what would happen. So if these two dreams from these men are dreams about the future and Joseph predicts it and those things come true, what does that tell Joseph about his own dreams? That he can trust them, that these are dreams from God, and he's also it's going to be reaffirmed obviously, but then by then it'll be obvious by Pharaoh's dream. So these two men, they tell Joseph his dreams, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I think there's kind of an interesting part about it. But if you go down to 13, here's Joseph giving the response to them. Verse 13, this is to the cupbearer. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to office. He will lift up your head and restore you to office. And then the other man the baker tells his dream, and he's a little bit excited because Joseph had told the cupbearer that he would be restored in 3 days. So in verse, 18, Joseph says, this is the interpretation, the 3 baskets of 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head. That's the same exact wording as the first guy. He's probably getting excited. From your head, from you, and will hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh off you. So he's being told you will die in 3 days. And then the cupbearer would be restored to his position in 3 days. And of course, what happens in 3 days? Okay. So what did Joseph ask of the cup? He didn't bother asking anything for the baker. That probably wouldn't have gone too well anyway. What did he ask the cupbearer? The what? Yeah, remember me. You're going back into the presence of Pharaoh. I'm innocent. I'm not really a slave. And I never did anything wrong. Could you please let Pharaoh know I'm innocent? I'm not sure if Pharaoh would really care about that, but he feels like he has an opportunity. So he's asking for it. And so now, how long would it take for that to maybe get to the point where maybe he'd hear something from it? I think he'd probably wait in a couple of weeks thinking, okay, I've got a couple of weeks, maybe a month, maybe he's going to look for the right moment. When would you start thinking that this guy isn't going to remember you? It'd be a few months, maybe 6 months. What are you thinking after a year? I'm going to rot in this jail. He doesn't care. He's forgotten all about me. And what would be how would you feel about that? Having your hope up that, okay, maybe this is it. And then it would be hard. But we see Joseph had to have had an attitude where he was going to continue trusting in God and doing what was right, because he wouldn't have been ready for what happened with Pharaoh if he had been in this like a despair or bitterness in that whole period. And so anyway, that's basically the end of chapter 40. Chapter 40, and then chapter 41. Verse 1, it happened at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream. And behold, he was standing by the Nile, and lo, from the Nile there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed in the marsh grass. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them from the Nile, ugly and gaunt. And they stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows. Then Pharaoh awoke. And he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain came up on a single stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 ears, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump and full ears. Then Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. And it came about in the morning that his spirit was troubled, so he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men, and Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them to Pharaoh. And that's when, who has his opportunity now? The cupbearer. The cupbearer is there, and he's like, well, I hate to remind you about the past when you were angry with me, but I would make mention today of my offenses. Pharaoh was furious with his servants, and he put me in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard, both me and the chief baker. And we had a dream on the same night, he and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now a Hebrew youth was with us there, a servant of the captain of the bodyguard, and we related them to him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each one he interpreted according to his own dream. And it came about that just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me in my office, but he hanged him. Then Pharaoh sent and called for Joseph, and they hurriedly brought him out of the dungeon. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, but no one can interpret it. And I have heard it said about you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph then answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. So Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, in my dream, behold, I was standing on the bank. So we already know the details of the dream, or the two dreams. And then we go down further, and what Joseph explains is the 7 fat cows and the 7 full grains of wheat, or grain anyway, are 7 years of plenty. And then they're going to be followed by 7 terrible, devastating years of famine. And that would represent the skinny, ugly cows and the shriveled up grains. And when they swallowed up the large ones, they were just as skinny and ugly as before. And this tells us that this famine is going to be really bad. And the fact that it's repeated twice, verse 32, it's determined by God, and God will quickly bring it about. And it says, now Joseph gives him advice. Since this is going to happen, I advise you to find somebody you can put in charge who will go out and prepare during the years of plenty. To organize, to have places to store crop and to guard it, and to have people over everybody in the crops. And then during the 7 years of famine, then you can open those storehouses and you can sell the food back to everybody. And so the Pharaoh is impressed with this, and he talks with his advisors, and he says, verse 38, can we find a man like this in whom is a divine spirit? So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has informed you of all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and according to your command, all my people shall do homage. Only in the throne I will be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Now I want to stop there, because this section Jerry wants to do tomorrow. And if not Jerry, if he's still feeling sick, LJ will take over. I'm not sure of all what Jerry's planning, but I know he wanted to focus on. Is that your understanding too, this section?
I haven't looked it over yet.
Okay, that's fine. All right. So what I want to do is just give a few charts and pictures to try to add some details here. Let's see if we can get this where it actually forwards. Good. All right. So I want to remind people of what we're talking about. It's good to have a little bit of a lesson in the history. But here's the land of Canaan up here. And then down here, which is a couple of 100 miles, depends on what part of Egypt we're talking about. But this area is the Delta, or you could call it Lower Egypt, but the Delta is the lowest part, because everything, remember the water's coming from the mountains and it's flowing down into the Mediterranean. So this is Lower Egypt, Upper Egypt, there's Cush, and then there's Ethiopia. And I just mentioned Luke as a way to remember that. Lower, Upper, Cush, Ethiopia. And so we would call this area Sudan today, and back then it was Nubia, is one of the names that they talk about. So you've got this whole region. I have here 2 cities, Memphis, which is the main capital in many of the different dynasties, and then Thebes was a capital. There's a couple other capitals in between where they had places where different pharaohs would set up. But just to kind of give you a reference point, this was a very, very long distance here, hundreds of miles, hundreds and hundreds of miles. And then there were these cataracts, the sections where there'd be like waterfalls or rapids, so you really couldn't get past those points easily. You had to work to get around. You couldn't just, take a boat up or down the section. And also over here is all desert, and over here is all desert. So you'd have this fertile area of the Nile and the canals, and any water you could get out, maybe a quarter mile or whatever distance you had for the crops and everything. And that was it. That was Egypt. All right. So next slide. And that's not quite okay. I don't know why it's not quite fitting, but that's all right. So this is a couple of things just to give you an idea. Egypt is divided up into section, and quite frankly, when you look at this, I'm going to talk about this afterwards, people really don't know the dates. They don't. They talk about it, they present it. It sounds a lot like things like evolution, where they get all these facts, and then when you really look at it, they're not facts. It is what they believe. It's what the consensus is. But there's no real clear understanding of the timing. But they had something that they knew was the Old Kingdom, which would be the 3rd through 6th dynasties, the Middle Kingdom, which was the 12th dynasty, and then a New Kingdom, which is the 18th to 20th dynasties. And in between them, they had these periods of intermediate periods. And those would be like where there'd be several pharaohs reigning in different places, different sections of Egypt. So there might be one in lower and mid and upper. And so you didn't have one pharaoh. The old, the middle, and the new is when you have one pharaoh over the whole entire Egypt, at least mostly. All right, so you have those 3 periods. And then you have a period of somewhere, and people debate when the Exodus was. And I think it was 1445 BC approximately, but people argue that it's 1250 BC. Especially a lot of scholars say, well, it was 1250 BC. So that they don't really know exactly the time. And there's nothing that absolutely proves it. And then Joseph would have been either 200 plus years before or 400 years plus, depending on how you determine how long they were actually in Egypt. Were they in Egypt 250 years or 400 years? Okay? So anyway, this whole chart is very speculative on many levels. All right, and you see things like this, and they just say, here are the pharaohs of Egypt, here are the dynasties of Egypt. But when you start studying it, you start realizing it's not just some weird people that say, I think it's really different than what it is. No, there's all sorts of serious problems with the dating that everybody does. This guy, I just picked his quote, but this guy was somebody in the early 20th century, and he says what is proudly advertised as Egyptian history is merely a collection of rags and tatters. Doesn't sound like they understand what the history is. There's a lot of empty places, and they don't have a lot of details. They might tell you, we know all about ancient Egypt. No, they know all about ancient Egypt in their kind of fabricated presentation of it, but they don't really know the details. There's just so much they don't understand about ancient Egypt. So when people tell you, well, we know there was no Exodus, and we know there's no Joseph because there was no records, there's not enough records to say things like that. And matter of fact, there are things that add to it. And there's a bunch of other people, like, I don't know if anybody heard of Velikovsky. If you're older, you might have heard about him. He was a kind of a weird guy that had this really weird theory about how to fit all the dynasties together. And this guy is a modern, he wrote a book on it too. He's a modern archaeologist, and he's written with a bunch of other people trying to tie together all the different ancient civilizations. And this guy also kind of a famous, but they have these very, very different presentations. And so what they do, and this is the part that's off the slide here, but these people end up shifting all these kingdoms. Some say, 50 years, some say 100, some say up to 250 years. We need to shift all the kingdoms. And they're not ludicrous arguments. And when people said to Velikovsky, well, you can't really prove your argument, he couldn't. But he always pointed out, but you can't prove your argument either. There's clear problems with your theory or with somebody else's theory. And so I say all that not because that's why I don't think it's worth spending a lot of time. If you're not really sure about the history, it's not worth spending all the time and trying to make some sort of argument from it where you don't know whether you're really building on rock. So I just wanted to mention that it's very iffy, and then they're not sure, which part was this to be shoved over more or less than this part. So there's all these debates about how to shift it over. But most people admit that this is not as old as they claim it is, and the time of the kings of the Exodus and Joseph, maybe you should shift everything forward a lot. I wanted to just put on here the two contenders, the pharaohs that people would say maybe were the pharaohs of the Exodus, was Tutmosis III, which would be about 1446 BC, or Ramses II, and put the second there, I guess, 1250 BC. So you got these two pharaohs that everybody would typically argue. It might not even be either one of those. It's possible. That's how little they really know. So you can't say, well, in the time of this pharaoh, there's no evidence of an exodus, because maybe what? Maybe he wasn't the pharaoh that had the exodus. And if you try to say, well, they knew all sorts of things about that pharaoh, well, they knew some things, but not enough to do that. Yeah.
I think the problem is that you're a pharaoh.
That's the other part.
Would you really want to record the greatest defeat
No.
of your nation?
You wouldn't even record the smaller defeats.
Right.
What are you going to focus on?
Well, you're going to focus on the victory.
Your victories, right. Well, that's another issue, too, and they recognize that. They know that. So, but people will argue anyway, well, there's no record of that. There's no record of the immense humiliation they suffered. Well, yeah, the Egyptians going to build this big monument to our humiliating defeat. No, it's probably not going to happen. All right, so, but anyway, just to point that out. You hear Ramses II, if you believe it's like here, and then actually there's people that would shift Ramses all the way up to the time of like Solomon. And I thought that was a little weird, but the more I've looked at it, the more I think there's possibilities. It's just there's so much that's uncertain that you can do a lot of shifting around, and there's legitimacy to it. All right. So anyway, and I'm going to have to translate this for you. I'm not sure why that's there. All right. So this is details of Egyptian culture around the time of Joseph that is consistent. So in other words, you look at things in the Bible, and people have noticed when they learn about Egyptian culture back then, the Bible seems to understand the culture of the time. It describes well. It's like Luke, when he's talking about Paul traveling around the region, he names officials, he names languages and coins and borders, and everything is exact. And they find a lot of details about the story of Joseph in Egypt are very consistent with what they've learned about that time. Again, just a couple of the things. A lot of people from basically the land of the Jews and further up that area migrating into the delta of Egypt throughout those centuries. That was very common. You had people migrating. They knew it for hundreds of years. There were people coming in, flowing into there. The Hyksos, there was a pharaoh named Salit, and the same title was given to Joseph in 42:6. When you read Genesis 42:6 in the Septuagint, it's called ruler, and it's the same name. So it's kind of interesting that this pharaoh of the Hyksos was called the Salit, and then Joseph is called the Salit. All the names in the story, the Egyptian names, are consistent with Egyptian names of that time. The dreams that Pharaoh had and the servants had, and then the way they dealt with them, it fits a lot with what they know about the dreams that people had in Egypt and how they interpreted them and everything. They had there was evidence of Semitic people living in Goshen, but Goshen is one of those places, they're not even really sure exactly where Goshen was. They kind of know it was on the eastern side of the delta, but they don't really know exactly. And people say, well, there's no record of the Israelites living there. But I think I mentioned before, but it's all just mud. So anything they built was going to be made of what? Blocks of dried mud. What happens to blocks of dried mud over a couple hundred years? They're probably going to turn, maybe not 200 years, but they're going to turn back to dust. And that's what happened to all the buildings that anybody had in that region. And if you came and brought imported stones from way up in the mountains in the south, and you floated them down the Nile or something like that, and you built yourself a great monument, a couple hundred years later, another pharaoh wants to make a great monument. He's got two choices. What can he do? He can go way up and get some stones, or he can take your stones and use it for his. And they repurposed a lot of stones that way. So the fact that they don't find a lot in Goshen, they don't find anything. What about writings? It's a very wet and muddy area. Papyrus isn't going to get preserved there. Where's it going to get preserved? In the drier places, further south, up in the mountains. And so those places, they have a lot of writings and other things preserved, but they're from different periods of time, and usually much later than the time of the Exodus. So you don't really have much of that information from that time. All right, so a couple of others. They had royal butlers and bakers, and they actually have from some of the drawings in the places, they would carry the bread on their head on a board, and that's almost exactly like what it was describing in the dream of the baker. The fact that Joseph shaved his face very quickly before going into the presence of Pharaoh, all the Semitic people, like the Jews, would have had beards. That would have been very important to them, whereas the Egyptians were clean shaven. And that's like just another detail that if you were Jewish, you wouldn't have thought about that kind of a thing if you were talking about your own people. But he's in Egypt, and that fits in. And then there was the 7 cows of the dream, and then we see paintings and records, and I think it's one of the dream books, but they have these, the Book of the Dead maybe, but they have these 7 cows. Kind of interesting. And it doesn't, I don't think that's referring back to the dream, maybe it is, but it's probably just that it was part of their culture, these 7 cows. So God is using their culture in the dream to make the point. But it's interesting, they have these celestial cows, the 7 of them. And also, he has titles of father to Pharaoh, Lord of all his house, ruler over all of Egypt, and there's, I think it was Genesis 45:8. That might be it. That can't be it. No. We'll have to see it. There's a place, I must not have updated it, but I put in the verse where it has all 3 titles that Joseph has. And we see those titles given to those royal officials. And so, excuse me? It is the right one, 45:8? Okay. I just assumed it'd be earlier. So 45:8, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, Lord of all his household, ruler over all the land of Egypt. Again, there's details like this that are consistent with Egyptian culture. So what is that telling us? Is just somebody making up the story 1,000 years later? Or that becomes, because you just use all sorts of different language and different wrong phrases. And so we know that. And Egyptian phrasing, there were certain things like years of famine or to hear a dream, where Jews would say understand a dream. And so hearing a dream it's just this wording that the Egyptians used. So they say this is very consistent with somebody who knew Egypt and was talking about events of Egypt. I find that interesting. So this is one of the more famous scenes. I have a couple of these. A famous scene. And this is the procession of the Hyksos, and in the tomb of I don't know how to pronounce Khnumhotep II, and I believe he's the grandfather of Justin Hotep. Not sure, but I did a check on that. But that was around 1850 BC. Again, those dates are really iffy. Okay, but they have this portrait painting in one of the tombs that shows all these people that are obviously Semitic, obviously people like the Jews coming down to Egypt at one point. And that could have been any of those groups of people. It doesn't have to be like the family of Israel. But everybody has pointed out this picture as something very interesting and consistent with what we see. There's another famous picture that shows these guys working, and they seem to be mostly slaves. Some of them seem to be Semitic, some of them seem to be Nubian, or the down in the southern part of Upper Egypt would have been the Nubian people. And so there's these people, and they're making stacks of bricks. So this guy's pulling it out of the form and stacking the bricks. These people are piling up the stuff and putting the bricks in. So they're doing everything with making bricks. And then this would represent a pond where they're going it in the water and mixing it. And so this is one of those scenes that they're really excited about. It's at a vizier in the time of Tutmosis III, which is the time possibly of the Exodus. But again, who knows? But anyway, this is one of those famous ones that people point to that seems very consistent with the Bible. And this one was from, and again, it talks about the 7 celestial cows and then the bull. So but then they talk about these 7 celestial cows, and they had, I think it was Isis and Horus. That doesn't sound right. Isis, it's up there somewhere probably. Hathor, that's it. Isis and Hathor were Egyptian goddesses, and they were often depicted as these cows. and they represented nourishment and love, and so they had these representations. But it's interesting that you have 7 cows. Kind of a neat thing. So people have talked about that. All right. And then also, I didn't want to spend a lot of time on this because when we get back to the story, I wanted to get more of the story done. But I just wanted to do a few thoughts. There's a lot of parallels between Joseph and Jesus. Joseph is clearly meant to be a type of Jesus. This is a shortened version of another chart I have. But I'm just going to go through these real quickly, and you can look them up if you want. But his brethren, the Israelites, hated him. Jesus and Joseph, right? Joseph was sent by his father to his brothers. Israelites plotted to put him to death. A special robe was taken from Joseph. Think about Jesus in all these. The Israelites seemed to put him to death, yet no body. 2 other prisoners, one saved, one lost. Falsely accused and punished, yet innocent. He was now above all other men, bow the knee, Pharaoh's signet ring, the fine linen, the riding in the chariot, all the things that showed it, and the special name he was given. And then he went from a proud position to humble position to proud position. Joseph alone had power to save all Israel and others. He was you could say almost like the bread of life. He could distribute the bread to the people. Dead Joseph was first seen by 10 brothers, then 11. That's kind of an interesting one. I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but it's kind of interesting. Because we see, the 10, actually the 12 apostles minus Judas because he's died, and then minus Thomas the first time, and the second time with Thomas. So it's kind of interesting. And when you start seeing a lot of these, you wonder. And the death they thought was now going to hurt them, yet it ended up saving them. They thought they were in trouble for having done that to Joseph. And God says, no, ultimately he meant it for your salvation. God sent Joseph to preserve Israel, and then also Israelites declare themselves servants of God and Joseph. They're coming and they're bowing down to him, acknowledging God and acknowledging him. And this part I want to take a few minutes to look at. I think you even mentioned this last night. But if you read Acts 7 and you go through the story, they've just rejected Jesus. That's the thing that Stephen wants to tell them. You've rejected the Messiah. So he gives them a history lesson about Abraham, but then he focuses on Joseph. And what happened to Joseph? They hated him, they rejected him, and then he ends up in a very bad place, but God exalts him, and then he's there to save his people. What happens with Moses? Well, the people are suffering. God sends Moses. They reject him. And then he's in a difficult place. God brings him back. And he's there to save his people. God exalts him up to a position of great authority where he can save his people. What happened with Jesus? Same exact thing. And that's what Stephen is trying to help them to understand. This is what God was planning all along. And you were going to reject him. And you did. And it shows your rebellion. All right, so anyway, these are just some examples. I think that was, that's it for this. So I'll just, let's see. I'm going to go back to the map. And I'll just leave it on there for a few minutes. So, getting back to the story, just a couple of details. So I just changed the page, that's why. So in chapter 41, now Joseph is made ruler over Egypt. Only in the throne is Pharaoh greater than him. He's got the ring. And his ring will give him, the Pharaoh's ring will give him the authority to make any, as long as he doesn't go against Pharaoh, he can do whatever he wants. And he's the one, because he signs the documents, So, at the end of chapter 41, it just mentions that during the years of plenty, he gathered up everything. Verse 49, he stored up grain in great abundance like the sand of the sea until he stopped measuring it, for it was beyond measure. Now before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph from the priestess, and he named the firstborn Manasseh and the second Ephraim. And then, by the way, he, as it says in verse 49, I read it, but I want to mention, they just stopped counting it. There was so much grain, they just stopped counting it. They just kept on storing it up, and they didn't even bother how much. It was too much. And so now, verse 54, the 7 years of famine began. Just as Joseph had said, then there was famine in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread. And I have to believe that wasn't like the first day. There had to have been a period where last year's crops, you're kind of waiting for next year's crops, but you get a little extra. But then all of a sudden you realize this crop's not working. And then your food's running out. And by the way, the Israelites living in the land were not destitute. They had animals. They talked about bringing down, we're going to see later they brought down pistachio nuts and honey and other things. So they had some food, but the major crop for any people is going to be some grains. And so they were really hard pressed. So anyway, verse 55 is important. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, you shall do. Which sounds a lot like how we're to look to Jesus. But when the famine was spread over all the face of the earth, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. And the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. And the people of all the earth came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe in all the earth. And then chapter 42, it switches up to the land of the Jews. So again, now they're down here somewhere in Egypt, but then the grain, probably a lot of the grain is down here. But the people living in Canaan and the surrounding areas would hear this grain in Egypt, and so a lot of people would be coming down. And Jacob also says, hey sons, go and get us some grain. And so who does he send? He sends everybody but who? Who wouldn't think? Benjamin. You think that would be noticed by the brothers? You think they already saw some sort of... I have to believe if he showed favoritism to Joseph and now he's unwilling to give up Benjamin, he probably showed that in the way he treated him. And the brothers probably weren't too thrilled with Benjamin either. So it continues. But anyway, he says, go down and buy us some grain. And verse 4, Jacob didn't send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, I am afraid that harm may befall him. And it gets worse than that, because it almost sounds like I'm willing to lose these sons, but not Benjamin. It sounds like that, but it seems to get worse than that. By the way, if you remember when Jacob was younger, when he was fleeing Laban, not fleeing, well, sort of fleeing Laban and coming back, and Esau is coming, how did he divide up his family when he thought Esau was coming to kill him? Yeah. Who did he put out in front? It wasn't Rachel with Joseph. Who was it? It's the maids and their children, and then it was Leah and her children, and then right next to him is the one, Rachel and Joseph. Benjamin wasn't there yet. But it's the same kind of thing that they saw it their whole life, I'm sure. So, they come down to Egypt, and I can imagine if they're going down, they're in Egypt, they might be thinking, I wonder if we're going to see Joseph. It's like I hear people say, oh, you're from Rhode Island, it's a tiny little state. Do you know this person? Well, it is still 1 million people. So it's probably not likely that you know somebody, right? Well, it's like you go to Egypt and you're looking for this slave guy somewhere, you're probably not going to see him. It's a pretty big place. But if you're going down to Egypt to buy grain, what's in your head? By the way, do we know that Joseph, what they did to Joseph is in their head? Are they remembering what they know what they did to their brother. I'm sure they haven't forgotten. And I'm sure the father hasn't forgotten it. Not that he knew what they did, but the loss of his son. So Joseph is ruler over all the land in verse 6. He was the one who sold to all the people in the land, and Joseph's brothers came and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he disguised himself to them and spoke to them harshly. And he said to them, "Where do you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." But Joseph had recognized his brothers, although they did not recognize him. And Joseph remembered the dreams. Interesting. So why is Joseph being very harsh with them? And why is he saying that they're spies? We don't know. That's the first answer. We don't know, right? But Is it seem like Joseph has certain motivations? What would be an important thing to Joseph to find out about his brothers? Have they changed? Are they the same brothers that threw me into that pit? Which by this time now, Joseph, we find out, because the 7 years of plenty have gone by, and when the family comes down, there's still 5 years left of the famine. So it would be about 7 to 9 years, so he's about 39 approximately. So he's 39 years. He hasn't seen his brothers in over 20 years. Have they changed? Are they different brothers? I can't help but think that he's not testing them to see if there's any kind of change. And maybe to put them more into a desperate situation to acknowledge the dream that they have to bow down to. But weren't they already bowing down to him now? Didn't he already hold all the cards now? So I think again, we don't know, but I think it was to test his brothers to see if they're really the same brothers that did that to him 20 years ago. And so, anyway, they give the story of what happened, and he says, you're spies. And he said, no, we're honest men, which is maybe something that would be hard for Joseph to hear. And then they said, verse 13, your servants had 12 brothers in all, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. Behold, the youngest is with our father today, and one is no more. Now, I don't know if they could have said, well, he got lost, but they say he's gone, he's dead. But Joseph said to them, it is as you said, you're spies. By this you will be tested. By the life of Pharaoh you shall not go from this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Now that would be another thing. Would Joseph be eager to see his younger brother, Benjamin? I'm sure how did all the other brothers treat him? Did he feel like they were a nice brotherly love there? But who would have maybe, any of his family would have been dear to him? Probably Benjamin, right? So he hears that Benjamin is alive and he wants Benjamin. So he says, okay, we'll make a deal. And I'm going to go through this just the quick way. But in the end, he says, all right, I'm going to hold one of you here hostage. The rest of you can go and I'll give you grain and you can go back to your father, but don't come back unless you have your younger son Benjamin with you. And verse 21, they said to one another, truly we are guilty concerning our brother, because we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us, yet we should not listen. Therefore this distress has come upon us. So they're remembering what they did to Joseph. And they're saying, I think this is God paying us back for that evil that we did back then. And Reuben said, did I not tell you, do not sin against the boy, and you would not listen? Now comes the reckoning for his blood. And they didn't know, however, that Joseph understood, for there was an interpreter between them. And what that really is saying is, because there's an interpreter, they're assuming, since there's an interpreter, he doesn't know our language. Right? Oh, because if there was no interpreter, that means he knows your language. But Joseph is acting like he doesn't know it, and the interpreter is telling him what those men are saying. So they're free to talk right in front of Joseph, without the interpreter there. And they're thinking he doesn't know our language, and Joseph grew up with that language. And so he hears it, and it says, he turned away from them and wept, but when he returned to them and spoke to them, he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. And I think this is a real test for them. Anyway, Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain and restore every man's money in his sack. They loaded their donkeys with the grain. They leave. When they get to the lodging place, they open their bags, and one of them notices what's in the bag. The money. The money's in the bag. And they're like, uh-oh, this is one more thing. It seems like all these things are happening. They're going to get us trouble. And what is this that God has done to us at the end of verse 28? So when they came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan, they told him all that had happened to them, saying, the Lord of the land, spoke harshly with us and took us for spies of the country. And then we told him the whole story. And then verse 36, their father Jacob said, you have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more. Simeon is no more. Think about that. Simeon is no more. What has he just done? He's just written off Simeon. What's the solution to getting Simeon back? Send Benjamin. But he's not going to do that. So he's like, well, too bad for Simeon. He's willing to just write off Simeon. That must have been a blow to the brothers. You would take Benjamin, all these things are against me. Reuben says, well, you can put my two sons to death if I don't bring them back alive. And he won't listen. He won't listen. So chapter 43, the famine continues. And then, I don't know how long it was, but it wasn't much more than, it was probably less than a year. And they say, we're running out of food again. You need to go down again. You need to buy some more food. He said, not without Benjamin. He said, no. He told us, you cannot come down again without Benjamin. And verse 6, Israel said, why did you treat me so badly by telling the man whether you still had another brother? And they said, well, he asked us questions, and we just gave him answers. How would we know that he would say, bring him down? Anyway, Judah says, I will be surety for him. I will make sure that I get Benjamin back here. So reluctantly, Jacob knows he doesn't have a choice. He sends Benjamin along with him. But he says, take the best products of the land. Verse 11, balm, a little honey, aromatic gum, myrrh, pistachio nuts, and almonds. And then take double the money in your hand and take back in your hand the money that was returned in the mouth of your sacks. Perhaps it was a mistake. Take your brother also. Arise, return to the man, and may God Almighty grant you compassion in the sight of the man, that he may release to you your other brother and Benjamin. And as for me, if I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved. He's not too happy about it, but he knows he doesn't have much choice. So they come down back to Egypt, and then Joseph invites them into his house. And they're immediately trying to tell the man, hey, we didn't take the money, and they're trying to get past that, and don't worry about it. Verse 23, be at ease, don't be afraid. Your God and the God of your fathers is giving you treasure in your sacks. I had your money. And he brings Simeon out to them, and then he tells them basically, you're going to have a meal. And Joseph asks about the welfare of their father, and they tell him he's well, and he sees Benjamin, and then he asks a question in verse 29. Is this your youngest brother of whom you spoke to me? And he said, may God be gracious to you, my son. And Joseph hurried out, for he was deeply stirred over his brother, and he sought a place to weep, and he entered his chamber and wept there. And again, this is 20 years later. And so it's been his brother was probably a very small boy at the time. We were talking about that. It doesn't tell us the time. But he was probably very young when he left. Then he washed his face and came out, and he controlled himself, and he said, serve the meal. And then told us about everybody being separate in the meal, but all the brothers were arranged how? Which would have been really hard, because all these brothers some of them were born in the same year, probably. So how were they arranged? From beginning to end, in order of their ranking of age. And that would have been kind of a very unlikely, the probability is pretty low of getting that right. And then what did he do to Benjamin? He gave him 5 times the portion. There's actually some Egyptian things about 5 times the amount that seems to be consistent. Anyway, let's see. So they have the meal. After they're done, he gives them food. He sends them away. But he tells his servant to take my silver cup and stick it in the sack of the youngest one, Benjamin. And there's actually cups of divination that the Egyptians had. They would pour oil in them and look at the surface of the oil on the water or whatever it was, and they would see the patterns, and they would use it for divination. So again, here's another little detail that's consistent with the culture of the time that they know about. So he puts the cup into Benjamin's bag. He lets them go, and then he chases them down, and he says, why did you steal my cup after I showed you all that hospitality? We didn't steal the cup. And they all say in verse 9, with whomever of your servants it is found, let him die. We also will be my Lord's slaves. The one who has it will die. We'll all be slaves. So he said, no. Now let it also be according to your words. He with whom it is found shall be my slave. The rest of you shall be innocent. So I'm going to give you a break. Only the one who took it will be a slave. The rest will be able to go home. And so after hearing this, Judah in verse 14, Judah now, it says, and his brothers came to Joseph's house, and they fell to the ground before him, and they're begging him. And Judah especially, what are they doing? They're caring about who? Who are they caring about when they come begging that Benjamin not be taken? Who are they caring about? The father, right? And Benjamin. Did they seem to have that kind of concern before? So Joseph is seeing them begging so that Benjamin wouldn't remain there, but also that the father wouldn't be bereaved of his favorite son. It was left to him. Verse 16, Judah said, "What can we say to my Lord? What can we speak? How can we justify ourselves? God has found out the iniquity of your servants. Behold, we are my Lord's slaves, but both we and the one in whose possession the cup has been found." But he said, "Far be it from me to do this. The man in whose possession the cup has been found, he shall be my slave. But as for you, go up in peace to your father." So Judah approached him and said, "My Lord, may your servant please speak a word in my Lord's ears, and do not be angry with your servant, for you are equal to Pharaoh. My Lord asked the servant, saying, 'Have you a father or a brother?' And we said, 'We have an old father, and a little child of his old age.'" And when that says little child, by the way, that could be somebody up into his early 20s. The way the word there is just, it could be a young adult, a youth. "Now his brother is dead, so he alone is left of his mother, and his father loves him. Then you said to your servants, 'Bring him down to me that I may set my eyes on him.'" So we did that. And even though we told you, he can't leave the father and everything, but we brought him here. And so he says, verse 27, "Your servant my father said to us, 'You know that my wife bore me 2 sons, and the one went out from me, and I said, surely he is torn in pieces, and I have not seen him since.'" So here's Joseph hearing his brothers, hearing about what they said to their father about being torn to pieces. "And if you take this one also from me, and harm befalls him, you will bring my gray hair down to Sheol in sorrow. Now therefore, when I come to your servant my father, and the lad is not with us, since his life is bound up in the lad's life, it will come about when he sees that the lad is not with us, that he will die. Thus your servants will bring the gray hair of your servant our father down to Sheol in sorrow. For your servant became surety for the lad. If I do not bring him back to you, then let me bear the blame before my father forever. Now therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the lad, a slave to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. For how shall I go up to my father if the lad is not with me, lest I see the evil that would overtake my father?" So now they have some real concern for the father, and Judah is showing some real integrity and saying, "Take me instead." And then what happens next? Joseph can't hold it in. He dismisses people. He cries before them. He makes himself known to his brothers. Verse 2, "He wept so loudly the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard of it." And then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. What would be the first thing that the brothers would think if they really know that's Joseph? What do you think what would be the natural thing to think? Especially if you're feeling guilty. Yeah, vengeance is coming. He's going to do something to us. He's in a position to hurt us badly. And but that's not what Joseph's going to do, but that you could understand they'd be very afraid at this moment. And "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt." And you think about Jesus as, this is the one that God made Lord in Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified. Same kind of idea, right? And "now do not be grieved or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." Now, later on, and I'm just going to read it now because we're not going to get to it. Chapter 50, verse 20. The brothers, after the father dies, that's a spoiler alert, sorry, Jacob dies, but the brothers come to Joseph and say, "Oh, he was just being nice to us while Dad was alive, so that way he wouldn't upset Dad. But once Dad's dead, now he's going to get his vengeance on us." Verse 19, Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid, for am I in God's place?" By the way, what does God teach? Who has the right to vengeance? God. We see it in Deuteronomy where God makes it very clear, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay." And then the New Testament quotes it. "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive." They didn't do it to be faithful to God. They didn't do it out of love for their father or their brother. They did it in an evil way, but God Joseph sees that God has used those events to bring about good. Isn't that the same thing with Jesus? God uses the evil to bring about something far greater. So, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. So he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. So that's just kind of jumping ahead to say that same message. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. All right. So now we go back to the section in chapter 40. Let's see, 5 verse 7 and following. All right. So God sent me here to preserve for you. There's still going to be 5 more years of a famine. And so now I want you to go. It's not you who sent me here, but God did. He has made me father to Pharaoh and lord of all his household, and ruler all the land of Egypt. Hurry, go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. And you shall live in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me. By the way, would that be an easy thing for Jacob to leave the land of Canaan? Why or why not? Why not? Yeah, isn't that the promised land? Isn't that the land that God said, this is the land that you're going to have your relatives after you? And so maybe it would be a concern to him. But Joseph is saying, you go send for Dad and tell him to come down here. And Pharaoh talks with Joseph, and he lets him know that I'll give him the best of the land, and you can bring them down. And don't worry about bringing anything. And they also sent a bunch of stuff loaded on donkeys and everything for the journey, it says in verse 23. And then he says to them, don't quarrel on the journey. In verse 24, it's always good advice. And anyway, verse 25, they went up from Egypt, and then they came to Jacob, and they said, Joseph is still alive, and indeed he is ruler over all the land of Egypt. But he was stunned, for he did not believe them. When they told him all the words of Joseph that he had spoken to them, and when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. Then Israel said, it is enough. My son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. So I want to make sure I read this next section here in the first 4 verses of chapter 46. So Israel, or Jacob, set out with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered the sacrifice. And remember this, in a lot of the stories it says from Dan to Beersheba. Dan is the northernmost part of Canaan, and Beersheba would be the southernmost part of the land of the Jews. So when they Dan to Beersheba, so he comes down and he's leaving the land. So like, you're now leaving Florida sign, and you're going somewhere else. But they're leaving, and as he's going there, he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, here I am. And he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt. I will also surely bring you up again, and Joseph will close your eyes. So God is giving him permission. And not only is he giving him permission to go to Egypt, but he's telling him how it'll end up. What's going to happen in Egypt? God will be with you. You'll get to be with Joseph. And then what will God do one day? Bring him out. Why should Jacob believe this? That's sort of an absurd question. But a lot of people, when God makes all sorts of promises to us, and we don't always believe them, do we? Like when he says, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. How many people always believe that when you're maybe struggling with bills or something like that? You think, what? I have to do it my way. I have to figure it out myself. But why especially should Jacob believe that?
Everything God's told him is coming to pass.
Yeah.
That'd be the first thing.
Absolutely. And what's the specific one that God promised him? You remember the story? When he was leaving, fleeing Esau because he had cheated him and done some rotten things by lying to his father, colluding with his mother and everything like that. And he's lying about why he's going. But now he's fleeing the land. Who appears to him? God appears to him. And what does God say? Don't be afraid. I'll be with you. And I'll do what? I'll bring you back. Was God with him the whole time? Yeah. You said 1/4 past, right?
Yeah.
Okay, 5 minutes. Okay. So, did Jacob already see that God can be trusted? Not that he trusted him at the time. He says, you know what, if you will indeed be with me and you will bring me back safely, you'll be my God. He said that. But God is saying something to him again. He shouldn't doubt it because God has already proven. He shouldn't doubt it anyway, but God has really proven himself to him. Yes, Darryl?
Do you think Abraham told Isaac and then Jacob about what God had told them?
I think they had to have. Yeah.
So does Jacob, you think, put some of that together? But God's told him to go, so...
I think this is just confirmation of what he's already heard from his father and grandfather.
They were going to be slaves.
Yeah, that was part of it too. But that wouldn't be necessarily right away, but God would be with them. And there's some debate about that too. But it's possible that the reason why they were slaves is because they were being very rebellious and not faithful to God while they were in Egypt too, right? That there's some verses that just make that point. But still, God did say they would end up as slaves. So yeah. Did Abraham tell him the whole dream? I don't know. Maybe he told him just part of it. We don't know for sure. I don't think there's any verse that really proves that, but it just seems like they were aware of all the promises that God had provided to Abraham. All right, so it mentions, so he's ready to go down, and he took everybody, and it lists all the sons, grandsons, great-grandsons, maybe a few great-great-grandsons, and it comes out to 70 persons. And then now they're going to travel down to Egypt. That's not including wives and daughters, and it's probably not including servants. So it might have been a lot larger multitude than just the 70. It could have been a very large multitude. But they go down to Egypt, and then Joseph goes out to Goshen to meet his family, and he meets his father. Very emotional response. No surprises there. And then he tells him, hey, Pharaoh is going to call. I'm going to set you up with Pharaoh. Tell him you're shepherds, and you'll get the land of Goshen. So that's going to get worked out. So he took 5 of his brothers. He presented them to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh is discussing things with them. And then he brings his father in verse 7, and it says Jacob blessed Pharaoh. That's kind of an interesting thing. Where else do you see somebody blessing somebody else and a big deal's made out of it? That's vague. I know where I'm going with that. Melchizedek with Abraham. And what does it say in Hebrews? Without any doubt, the lesser is blessed by the greater. Here's a Pharaoh, and who's blessing Pharaoh? Jacob. Which, in a lot of ways, there is a very big distinction here too. But anyway, so Jacob blesses Pharaoh, and then verse 9, Jacob said to Pharaoh, the years of my sojourning are 130 years. Few and unpleasant have been the years of my life. And that 130 years is used to calculate some of the dates forward and backwards. Nor have they attained the years that my fathers lived during the days of their sojourning. Jacob blessed Pharaoh, went out from his presence, and then they settled. Notice it says they settled in the land of Ramses, which is a lot of people, when they look at the timeline, because the Exodus, they were building the cities of Ramses and Pithom, they said that has to be this time. The problem is, it talks about Joseph settling in Ramses too. So that's probably something that was already named beforehand, and it doesn't really, and people have made that point, that it doesn't prove that had to be the time. And they could have changed the name later. So that doesn't really matter. And then last couple of details. We're there, okay. We'll just stop right there. Thank you for your attention. I guess he's got a message for everybody.